I am a human being and I killed human beings.
Before I knew it, I'd fired 4 shots at the door. I kept on shouting for Eva to phone the police.
Tests are underway to determine if a serial killer is on the loose in Centurion, Pretoria.
The dead won't bother you. It's the living you gotta worry about.
In South Africa, 58 people are murdered every day. Would have been accurate the last time we recorded this podcast. In South Africa, 71 people are murdered every day, according to the latest statistics. These are the stories of the criminals and the people who hunt them. My name is Paul Llewellyn. I'm a journalist and filmmaker curious about Africa's killers, criminals, and the cops who catch them. And joining me to discuss crime on the continent, as always, is Gerhard, the former cop and current head of LNS Threat Management, who led the investigative psychology section of the South African Police Service from 2001 until 2016. In his time there, he worked on over 300 serial murder and rape cases, and he is the profiler. Please visit our YouTube page and subscribe. That's youtube.com/c/profiler Africa. Do subscribe and encourage your friends to do so too. We're available wherever you get your podcasts, on iTunes, SoundCloud, Spotify, all those kinds of places. Simply search Profiler. Again, please share the link that you like to use with friends at the office, in the gym, or in your murder cult. Gerard, it's lovely to see you again. It's been a while. So now 71 people are murdered every day in South Africa. So our podcast has not, the 19 episodes that are sitting online have not been helping crime at all in the country, as has nothing else that anyone's been doing. It's all just been getting worse. That said, let's not start on a downer. Let's start on an upper. How are you, Gerard? What's been going on great and positive in your life as a profiler?
Well, hello, Paul, and hello, listeners. Yeah, I think things have been going good. You know, it's summer, which always is a good time for me. I just don't like the winter months, so it's nice that things are warm, feeling more like happy and about. Crime-wise, I mean, obviously the case we're going to be talking about today, which is for me was a very important case in my career, he's been convicted, he's been sentenced, and he's doing his time in jail, and that's great.
And you're right, today's case, I think, is just lots of twists and turns and lots of a lot of things you see happening a lot in South Africa, but certainly a guy who really tried his utmost to kind of weasel his way out of being held accountable for quite a brutal act. I'm going to be very interested to discuss his psychology in particular. I think that's something I'm very curious to understand, because I think it speaks to a lot of the kind of issues. I'm curious to know if it'll speak to a lot of the issues that we see with just kind of men in South Africa not being able to handle their rage very well. He's certainly an extreme example of that. I do want to say that the one thing we're going to try and focus on in the podcast is two things. Well, two things we're going to try and focus on. One is consistency, because I think that's been our biggest problem. We've got 19 episodes up, but we do want to be a bit more regular, and we've kind of had a sit down and a discussion about how we can do that, and I think we've kind of figured that out. And so our plan is to be bringing you an original new episode every week, which is something we've spoken about before. So, you know, let's not talk about it and let's just do it. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is the feedback on me not talking as much as I do, apparently I talk too much. You don't talk enough. I talk too much, which I'm doing right now. So let's jump into our first case. Andrea Venter, the murder of Andrea Venter. Let's go right back to where this starts. Andrea Venter meets a man.
Yeah, sure. So if I recall correctly, she met Gerhard Jansen van Vuuren about 2007, if I recall correctly.
Yes.
I think it was a wedding. They start to sort of date. He's at that point I think he was living overseas. They start to hit things off, and then she goes to visit him. Things go okay. Although at one point he's angry with her and doesn't want to give her a pass or ticket back, and that gets sorted out. She comes back, and thereafter, sort of the relationship continues, and it almost follows, sadly, one of these classical textbook examples of domestic violence, of a guy who engages in controlling behavior. You can't speak to other people. He has a fit if she smiles at someone else, or if he doesn't know where she is. And so as time goes by, physical violence towards her, injuring her, throwing her to the ground, hitting her, slapping her, strangling her, sometimes to the point of her sort of losing control over bowel movements, it goes on towards sort of protection orders that are later taken out, which he just just ignores. He just doesn't have any feelings for protection orders, and the cops on the same side are not really doing their job properly. They do contact the cops when he's transgressing a protection order, and they don't do anything, or they phone him and say, hey, don't do that again. But there's no real consequences for him for when he does transgress an order of the court, which he had obtained. And of course, as we often see with a lot of domestic violence relationships, there's sort of this splitting up, back together, splitting up, back together, splitting up, back together. And part of that is often this person breaking down their female partner. And of course, this happens in same-sex relationships also. But just for the sake of this case, we're going to refer to it as the same as a male and female relationship. And essentially, she kind of breaks her down, you're not worth anything. And that often is one of the things amongst many that keep people in these horrific relationships. But as time goes by, I guess she more solidifies that she wants to get away from this. She finishes her studies at Potch University. She was studying accounting. And essentially what happens is she finishes her degree, and this would have been at the end of 2010, and she says to her mom and dad, who stay in Rustenburg, listen, this is what's going to happen. I'm going to get my qualification, I'm going to look for a job, and I'm going to move. And I'm not going to tell anybody except you, obviously mom and dad, where I'm going, where I'm staying, new phone number, and who I'm working for. And the parents support this because they can see that it's just this guy is a terror. He would, amongst other things besides abusing her, threaten to kill her parents, threaten that if she doesn't behave, he's going to drop her off naked in a township and black people are going to rape her, sort of bringing this whole racist element into everything. And he was himself a rampant racist, Gerhard Jansen van Vuuren. And terrorizing her family, and if you leave me, I'm going to kill your parents, So really lots of things that keep people in these horrific relationships.
In South Africa, the statistics are interesting. In the world, something like 27% of women and girls aged 15 and older have experienced physical or sexual intimate partner violence. 27%. In South Africa, the figure is a third up to 50%. So it really is a major issue. And this is one of those things which has come up on the podcast, and where it's a case of, I always recall that whenever we've spoken about things like rape, you always talk about the fact, which is, not necessarily always a factor in intimate partner violence, but just when it comes to a statistic like rape, how much worse it is in South Africa in reality, as opposed to what the statistics are that are published every year, that it's potentially something as 20 times as bad as the figures that are being released by Becky once a year.
So if you look at, whenever you look at crime stats, the safest way to make stats comparable is if you calculate it per 100,000 people of the population. Otherwise, if you say in South Africa it's this percent, that percent, you're not comparing it adequately because population sizes differ. So when we compare it for femicide in general, a study we did that I was very much fortunate to be a part of with the Medical Research Council that does really amazing studies when it comes to femicide and sex crimes. They did a study in 1999, 2009, they repeated it. In 2017, repeated it. And I was part of the 2017 project. And the percentage per 100,000 in South Africa it actually dropped from 1999, it was 24.7 out of 100,000. In 2009, it was 12.9 per 100,000. And 2017, 11.2 per 100,000. But the global figure is 2.3 per 100,000. So even with it dropping a bit, between 1999 and more recently, we are still, almost like 4 or 5 times. And when it comes to within femicide, because femicide is the murder of a woman, doesn't matter what the motive was. But when you look specifically intimate partner stuff, we were 99, 8.8 per 100,000, 5.6 per 100,000 in 2009, and 4.8 per 100,000 in 2017. But the global average, remember, 4.8 is the most recent stat. The global average is 0.8 for intimate partner femicide. So again, we are like 4 or 5 times what the global rate is per 100,000.
And this is not something you can put down just to the fact that, we have cases that are reported on. We're talking about countries that will have even more accurate reporting potentially on kind of these things and statistics available to them.
Yeah. And remember, murder, at least, as long as you find the body, you can say it's a femicide. It's a dead woman. Whereas sex crimes and domestic violence often doesn't get reported to the police. So when you're talking murder stats, you kind of unless your country just doesn't have accurate stats at all, like in some very undeveloped countries. But, femicide is, as I said, it's basically, femicide is really, is there a dead woman who was murdered? And so those stats tend to be more accurate than, like, as I said, sex crimes and domestic violence, because there often it's impacted by people just don't go to the police and report these things.
Gerhard's history. Do we know much about his background prior to his relationship with Andrea? Does he have a background of similar behavior?
So yes. Now, and this is always a difficulty with, what we've discovered from an investigation side and what you can introduce in court. And introducing someone's previous bad behavior, like a previous conviction, you can't do during the trial, because they'll say that's prejudicial. To say that you have 5 previous convictions for domestic violence while you're still leading the evidence of the current case, they say, but that's prejudicial. If the court hears that, then they're more likely to convict you. But you have to judge each case on its own merits, because the fact that you've done something 5 times before or 10 times before and been convicted of it isn't proof that you've done this one. So that's why things like previous convictions are only introduced at sentencing after you've been found guilty or not. So it would sway the mind, and I think it's understandable, of the jury if you had one, or here in South Africa of the judge or magistrate. So a lot of these things that we knew about his previous behavior from having interviewed various people, including ex-girlfriends, he had a long-standing history of domestic violence towards previous girlfriends. Andrea was not the first person he had exhibited that behavior. But we also know, again, from interviews from his mom and other people, that there was domestic violence in his parents' relationship. And in many ways, Gerhard was very similar to his father in how he treated women and his view of women. And that's why Gerhard's mom left his dad, because of this pattern of domestic violence. So there's almost like this family history or learned behavior to some degree of how do we treat. So you have the genetic, that's sort of biopsychosocial. You've got the genetic predisposition, but you've also got what he was seeing in his family relationship towards women.
Let's just take a little bit of a diversion. I want to ask you a question. You are given the role of being the national psychologist, and you need to deal, and you're given the task of dealing with men's behavior towards women and children in South Africa. Where do you think some of the root of this problem is, and what do we need to do to address this problem kind of globally in South Africa?
Well, I think definitely one of the biggest ways you're going to impact it is if we can get the message into homes where children are that this is not acceptable behavior. And that comes with communicating the message women are equal or of equal value in society, that have the same status and rights as men, that women are not seen as something less worthy and less meaningful in society. So that's one of the important messages we need to get across to children. And that using violence to solve any problem, domestic or otherwise, is not an acceptable solution. So that is a message that has to be educated to children from a very young age. Women are equal, and violence is not a solution to get people to do what you want. It's not acceptable. So that's the starting point in changing long term. So it's changing attitudes in the same way that 50 years ago, what was the attitude towards smoking? Very different towards the attitude nowadays. And why? Because of public information, campaigns, restrictions on advertising, et cetera, and that's kind of in a way what you have to do with negative attitude in society towards other things. And then secondly, that when people do this behavior, that they're going to be effectively investigated and prosecuted. So that's the other side, because again, if you feel there's no consequences for your behavior, it doesn't matter what attitudes you may or may not have, what laws we have, what punishments we have, if you don't think you're going to be caught and convicted with any level of certainty. And that's the same for any kind of crimes, really. That there will be consequences, and if I lift a hand, oh my goodness, I'm going to get arrested, and I'm going to get convicted, I'm going to spend some time in jail.
Yeah.
So there's a carrot and the stick.
Yeah, and we can't keep the lights on. Do you know what I mean? Because you'd think that surely you go, where is the dramatic intervention? Not just, it's gotten to the point where it shouldn't just be of, everyone, it's always in South Africa, it feels like, we got to wait for the government to do something about it. It feels like surely we're at the point where the nation themselves, where the women of the country it has to exist, an opposition to this dialogue, this conversation needs to happen outside of just the 16 days of activism at the end of every year, when it feels like there's some kind of lip service paid to this problem, but there's nothing really. It is surely like the fundamental problem with South African society.
It's got to be a message, like you said. You can't expect the people who support this attitude to be the ones to educate their children differently. So we do have, the government does have to take an effort to bring to this message across in schools, enforce it in schools of the equalness of all people and the value of all people. Public campaigns out there in the workplace, etc. When it comes to sexual harassment policies. So it really, unfortunately, does have to come from the outside, because the people who support these attitudes aren't going to be the ones to teach their children differently.
Of course, the other thing in South Africa is the aspect of just the patriarchal nature of the society, and the fact that, yes, you know, you may go and stand in a queue and vote for a particular system, but that is not really affecting your behavior back in the house, because, you know, you may be voting for equality and kind of putting your mark of support for your woman's equal rights, but then you're going home and behaving like, behaving abusively. It's just like the two haven't connected. It's like, I think the nation needs to understand that there's a responsibility that comes with living in a democratic society under a constitution where everyone's rights are guaranteed regardless of kind of race, color or creed or gender. So it's such a big topic, and it's something we've spoken about plenty of times on the podcast. It's one of those ones where we can kind of point out the fact that it's probably, I think, the biggest problem in the country these days. Forget things like load shedding. Maybe cases like this do illuminate it a little bit, where you can see a little bit of familiarity with the patterns that happen in your life. So what happened next with Andrea? I mean, she tried her best. She realized that she was in a situation that was dangerous to her with a guy who was obsessive and had issues, and she tried to get out of that situation.
And the legal system, she did everything that she was supposed to, and the legal system failed. I mean, this is why when people sort of say which case stands out of your career, it's this one, because it's so unfair. All the things. Here is a young girl who did all the right things in terms of trying to change the situation, what mechanisms were there in terms of protection orders, and the system failed her. And then it failed her again, as we'll get into the rest of the case study, and after she was dead, it failed her, etc. So she relocates to Johannesburg, gets a job in an accounting firm as per her qualification that she studied, was initially staying with a friend in Joburg, then decided it's safer if I move out, for her, and, if something does happen. And she doesn't want her friend to become the target of the wrath of Gerhard should he, find out where she's staying. She gets into a little flat in Sibaya Sands, a very nice place, in Fourways in Johannesburg, near Monte Casino. Was working happily. I think she's got a new car. I think she had a new cell phone number. And Gerhard obviously realizes he doesn't know where she is and can't get hold of her. But he knows that she studied accounting. So he literally phoned 34 accounting firms in Johannesburg until who answers the phone? Andrea Venter at number 34 or 35, and essentially forces his way back into her life. And I can imagine from her side thinking, what else can I do? I have relocated. I'd taken protection orders previously. I relocated, to a different town. And
it is so difficult as a victim to get out from underneath these manipulative people, isn't it?
And there were emails that I have seen where, after he found her again, where she's sending emails to mom saying, "Mom, help me? What do I do now? You got to find a solution for me because I cannot get away from this guy." And then you can really read the desperation in her voice, where she's saying to her mom, "Please do anything." You almost feel like she's almost thinking, can you get someone to go and break this guy's knees, to make him get the message? That's, not he doesn't ask that, but that's kind of the desperation you read almost between the lines in, what else must I do?
What do you do as a family, though? I mean, there's only so much you can do, isn't there? I mean,
It's horrific. And I think that for the poor parents and family members who can see this and feel so helpless, and I think as a parent, you want to go there and just do something to this guy. But if you want to stick with the boundaries of the law, you've got to try and force the police to go and act, get him arrested. If he lays a hand on you, open up a criminal case and hope for the best that that's going to keep him at least for a period of time in custody. But we also know that people get bail while their trial is awaiting. And what are they going to do to you then? So I think it's this fear of, and a lot of victims said, if I take a step, will it not actually make things worse? And sometimes having a horrible situation that you understand is better than taking that step that might push it over the edge. And I understand that. Unfortunately, police see it very simplistic. Well, you need to go open up a case. But, but the police are also not going to give you protection. They're not going to stand outside your door and protect you. So, and I think because we don't have a lot of faith in the law enforcement system in South Africa, that the cops are going to be there in 2 minutes when I phone them, because we know they're not based on the statistics, people often feel like it's perhaps better to try and navigate this horrible situation than to take those next steps.
we have a system, a police system that's going backwards, and yet what we really need is a system that's able to adapt to the world that we live in. You'd think that in this day and age, the law had aligned itself to social and digital media and the impact that the kind of the tool that is for people who are stalkers, who are obsessed types like this guy. You'd think that there is kind of clear law to identify this, because I imagine it happens a heck of a lot these days, from that guy that just won't stop, phone bombing you at 2:00 in the morning, right through to a man like Gerhard, who is kind of becomes the extreme version of that and ends up committing murder. I mean, it's one of those discussions where it's like, there's not even a law to identify stalkers that speaks to that reality, is there? Could you just talk to that a little again?
Yeah, so I mean, in South Africa, we don't have stalking laws, or there's no crime defined as stalking. So you cannot charge someone in South Africa with the crime of stalking. Now, that doesn't mean that when someone's stalking you, well, you can't do anything, because a lot of stalking behaviors do contravene some existing law. Yeah. So if I am hacking into your Facebook account or your phone, or that's against the sort of cybercrimes, I think it's the Cybercrimes Act. If I am insulting you and saying derogatory things, that's crimen injuria. If I, scratch your car, that's malicious injury to property. If I push you and hit you, that's assault. If I come into your house without permission, that's trespassing. So a lot of stalking behaviors do meet an existing law, and you will be charged with that specific crime. But those are very often not.
It's not very user-friendly.
It's not very significant. I mean, charging someone with criminal injury, they're not going to arrest the person.
But also, as a victim, you need to be able to. You just want to articulate that this guy is stalking me.
Yeah.
These are the things he's doing, and I, as opposed. So, you're not necessarily as well read in the. You have to be a bit more sophisticated to be able to go and identify specific laws that are being broken.
And
it doesn't make it user-friendly,
they don't represent, and they don't often really convey the overall umbrella of the stalking behavior. And these might be opened up at different police stations, because he scratched your car at your place of work, which is, Randburg police station. But he's done this to you at your house. That is, I don't know, whatever the side's, Honeydew police station.
And we know how well that's going to work in this current system.
Yeah.
You're going to get nowhere.
So and even if you're convicted of something like criminal injury, you're not going to go to jail for it. So it's not a solution to keep this guy away from you, because he's going to be sitting in jail for the next year or two. And very often, as victims say, but won't that make things worse? And often, I've never met a jealous, controlling, possessive ex-boyfriend who is happy that you've opened up a criminal case against him and that he might get convicted. That usually does anger them. And victims realize this, but cops don't get it. Well, why don't you open up a case? Well, because he could kill me if I do.
3 years of animosity building up in jail do not help the situation. You're right.
Absolutely.
And I mean, in this case, what's interesting is how her plight goes right up to the point of her death. All of this is kind of relevant to her reality right up to her death. I mean, she's calling for help. She's screaming for help in the parking lot of her complex with people around her. And he's still committing violence against her in front of people.
Yeah.
You know, even that can't keep him away from her.
Yeah, I mean, so this sort of all culminates on the 2nd of May, 2011. So yeah, so 6:20 on the 2nd of May, it was a Monday morning. It was a public holiday because the 1st of May on the Sunday was a public holiday. So obviously, you know, still quiet time for everybody, chillaxing on a public holiday. And she's heard screaming, and seen running towards the front entrance security room, where the cars come and enter and leave the particular complex, and with Gerhard Jansen van Vuuren running behind her with a knife in his hand. And he runs up and basically catches up to her at that sort of security guard's little room in between the in entrance and exit for the vehicles at the front of the complex. And essentially, you know, basically stabs her some more. We think he stabbed her while she was running also. And then basically the security guard says she falls to the ground. He comes behind her, lifts her up, and basically slits her throat twice. Then sort of confronts the security guard, he's not an armed security guard, unfortunately, so I think it's a bit unfair to expect him. And Gerhard Jansen van Vuuren was a very big guy who was allegedly doing steroids at the time. So this poor security guard, who's basically, Gerhard sort of half comes at him with a knife, and then he backs off, and he starts obviously calling for backup. And Gerhard then basically cuts his own throat and lies down next to her in the sort of driveway of this of the complex where she stays. And you know, obviously the police
all
are
very dramatic.
Very dramatic. You know, he then takes off his jacket.
Final words like "it's all done now" or something like that.
Yeah, so he takes off his jacket, puts it down, lies down next to her. You see him doing something, taking something off that was around her neck, throwing it aside.
Yes.
And basically lies down next to her body, and she's not moving. We know this because some of this is now on CCTV footage. We don't see the actual stabbing because unfortunately the camera wasn't aimed at where the incident took place, which is right outside the guard hut. The camera was aimed more at the driveway where the cars come out. So we see him then bring her body, plonk it on the ground. He lies down next to her, then takes off the thing around her neck, throws it to her side, and then kind of lies there. And eventually you see the paramedics arriving. So, she's basically dead at the scene, and you can see on the CCTV footage she's not moving. You know, very soon after her throat was cut. He arrives. The police and paramedics arrive. They treat him. They manage to stabilize him, and he's eventually taken off to the hospital. The police then go and think, oh, hang on, this is a domestic case. Maybe there are kids in the flat, because obviously they don't know the ins and outs of who's who. And they go to her flat and look inside. On the bed, they see the bed is made, the pillows are in place, her laptop is open, and there's blood on the bed. There's a bedside table with 2 plasters that are covered in blood. There's blood and what appears to be her hair in her toilet bowl in her flat. So clearly something had happened in her flat, that, this incident didn't just, kind of take place outside. Mm-hmm. They go to her car and they actually see what looks almost like a noose around the seatbelt. And it turns out to be the same item that he removed from her neck. It was one of those. And these seem to be these gym straps. They're almost like, I describe it like a karate belt type of material. And it's about, I would say, half a meter long, maybe half a yard long. Mm-hmm. And this particular one in her car had been looped as like a loop and then cable tied. So it almost looked like this was something that he would get her in that seat, put a seatbelt on, and then pull the noose over her neck so she can't easily get out. So
these are Velcro straps or whatever? What kind of straps?
They don't actually have anything. So he in the car.
Oh, like those rubber resistance things? Or?
No, it's made out of material, almost like a karate belt.
Oh, so, okay.
I don't know exactly. I guess they wrapped around their hands when they're doing weights. I don't lift weights at the gym. Okay. So this now tells us that the story has a little bit of history. Something happened in the flat, and then of course the rest of it happened outside the flat. They also, though, in her car find a bunch of keys. The dad finds keys, and he realizes, but these aren't Andrea's keys. They're not her workplace's keys. And it turns out that these were Gerard's keys that were in her car. And when they go eventually a couple of days later to Gerard's flat with the investigating officer and Gerard's dad and, of course, Andrea's dad, the keys open up his flat. So we confirmed that those were his keys in her car. And inside, we see her overnight tog bag, a little toiletry bag, and blood on the floor. And that blood is later forensically linked to Andrea. So we know now this incident started at his flat. They must have then come in her car with this noose thing attached to this seatbelt, so essentially indicating that she was not necessarily voluntarily going back to her flat. And something happened, most likely in relation to the computer, that he was maybe forced her to open up and show us the items.
Any blood or anything in the car that would suggest that the violence was happening?
No, so based on the photographs that you got here in front of me, there was no indications of blood in the car.
Okay.
So it's unlikely she was stabbed in the car.
So all the major violence happened once they'd gotten to her flat.
Yeah.
So the idea is that an argument started at his house. Mm-hmm. He then ties her up in the car basically to make sure that
he can get her back
to
her
flat,
place. So it was important for him to get her back.
He wants to now look at something on the computer, which has obviously added to the rage, and then it's escalated to the point that he's physically attacked her with a knife. And he had also a knuckle duster with him
in his.
All right, we'll carry on then.
Yeah. So this tells us that this was not just a snap. This was, and we know there's a history of domestic violence. So that again is essential in court to try and illustrate, as far as you can, introduce that evidence that this was not a guy, happy-go-lucky, wonderful guy, and one day he just commits this out-of-character crime. We have a guy who's threatened to kill her, who has assaulted her. He's threatened in the past he's going to slit her throat. We have that in statements and affidavits from other people. So in a way, this is, I wouldn't say it's predictable, but it's not surprising where this ended up.
It's sad to know, when you hear about things like the toiletry bag being found at his place. She's obviously, he's really pulled her back into this thing.
Yep.
Because it is easy to go, oh, well, he's got this history and she put herself in this situation time and again. But again, it just speaks to the nature of abuse and how difficult it is to break this cycle.
Especially when you have tried to use all the mechanisms available to you. And from the state side, they didn't do their job.
She was still alive, whether fatal wounds had been made upon her. At the time that she's running to the security guard, she was still alive. And even when she's with a security guard, there's people coming out of their apartment. That's when he slits her throat. Yeah. She's still not safe. Yeah. She was, it just the inevitability of what happened to her is just so sad, isn't it?
Yeah, unfortunately.
What was his behavior like in the kind of the aftermath then of the crime? What happened to him in the immediate aftermath of the crime?
So as I said, the paramedics arrive, they treat him, they save him. He gets sent off to hospital where he's under police guard. He's obviously arrested, and his bail is denied. So he twice applied for bail in the magistrate's court. So obviously bail is when you're released out pending your trial, so that you're not kept in custody, and the conditions and requirements you have to meet. So we successfully opposed bail twice in the magistrate's court, and I'd written a report which was used as an argument to oppose bail. And then in December of that year, of 2011, so he's in custody at the waiting trial section of the prison for about 8 months. We suddenly get a phone call from the dad, and the dad says, "Hey, he's got bail." I'm like, "No, we opposed bail." He says, No, he went to the High Court and asked the High Court to review his denial of bail by the magistrate's court. And the High Court granted him bail. Now, I was very angry because I didn't know anything about this review. And what I would have liked and expected is that the prosecutor, who would have dealt with it in the High Court, would contact me as one of the main witnesses in the magistrate's bail application to say, listen, there's this appeal or review. I'd like to speak to you about it, so I understand what you were saying.
Is this the same prosecutor who would have dealt with it in the lower court?
No, this would be a different one because it's now in the High Court. It's an advocate. So he wouldn't really have known exactly the details of the history.
And it wouldn't just be the case that this lawyer would naturally kind of get in touch with the prosecution team from the other case to go, what do you know?
I would say he should. want to speak to the detective, I think, who was testified, and me as the main expert witness, I would think, if anything, to just familiarize himself with exactly what was the circumstances. I mean, I would have said to him, great, I'll sit next to you while you're arguing this, that I can just highlight if they're getting something wrong. And which clearly didn't happen. And if you read the judgment by the judge when he granted him, it's very clear that the judge misunderstood the message I was trying to convey. He said, because I'd said that this guy's a great risk, and also he has transgressed all the previous protection order requirements. Now, if you see the protection order as an instruction from the court on how you're supposed to behave, and then you see bail requirements as an instruction for the court how you're supposed to behave, he didn't abide by the protection order instruction from the court, so why do you think he's going to abide by the bail? But the court just said, well, these two were back together with each other dating, so therefore the protection order doesn't mean anything. So that's not the point I'm raising. So very frustrating when I finally got that judgment, which is available publicly, to see that the judge misunderstood it. And if I'd been there or consulted with that advocate who was representing in the High Court, I would have made sure that he understood that the essence of what I'm trying to convey in my evidence was he doesn't abide by court rules. And sadly, he was granted bail. And obviously then,
He managed to work the system and slip through a crack. That's really what happened here.
Yeah.
Can I say that?
Yeah,
Do you
essentially.
would I be wrong in saying
it's a
that?
legal avenue he could pursue to go to the High Court to review it.
If you play the system, or if you take part in the system, it can, you can, if you don't, you're not going to find those little exit points, are you? So, and you can kind of count on the fact that in South Africa, chances are the prosecution won't come and speak to you, or won't speak to the detective, or won't really, because he's probably got a really high caseload and workload, and or he didn't put himself in the way of somebody like you who was really familiar with the case and with this guy, to help them to prepare.
And I don't know what their normal procedures are for reviews. 'Cause, I've never had one of my cases reviewed in the High Court for bail, so I don't know what they should have done. But one would think that you would want to make sure you've briefed yourself completely about the case and what the issue is, and not just I don't know.
I mean, at least he is being let out by an actual judge. Since we've been making crime content, especially with the TV show stuff, I came across we did one case, a policeman down in Cape Town who was murdered in the early 2000s by some bank robbers. And he was shot 50 odd times on the side of the road. They caught a bunch of them. In the build-up to the trial, 3 of them escaped. 1 of them was killed. 2 of them were recaptured. So for all intents and purposes, 5 of them were charged with the murder of this guy and sentenced to life sentences. Now, 20 years later, the daughter of this cop was getting a call from correctional services to say the 2 of these guys are kind of up for parole, and there's a process. The victim, what's it called? The victim
offender dialogue.
The victim offender dialogue process. Do you want to take part in it? And they wanted to take part, because if you take part, then chances are the person will sit in jail for a little bit longer than they might have. So they were like, okay, well, what about the 3 other guys? The 3 other guys have vanished. We've spoken to the NPA, we've spoken to correctional services, we've spoken to the police. Nobody knows where 3 of them are. They just vanished out of the system. And it's not the first time we've heard that story of people just kind of disappearing out of jail, out of correctional services. So at least it's a judge making this decision. I would say it's also the chances are, if he's a wily guy like this, he's going to find his way just to bribe a guard to get out,
Yep. So what happens thereafter? So like I said, he's in custody. Essentially, he does get sent for mental observation at Sterkfontein Hospital to the west of Johannesburg, which is a government-run hospital that does forensic assessments for court purposes. And he goes there from about 11th of June till 10th of July 2012, in other words, the year after the murder. He was released, obviously, in December 2011 on bail. And we prepare for trial, which would have taken place in 2013, also thinking about May. But he's found fit by the psychiatric team. Remember, it was a team of people that assessed him: nursing staff, psychologists, 2 psychiatrists, social workers, you name it.
At this point, Can I ask you, because in your book you say that this is kind of one of the very important cases in your career, and it's really a standout case for you. And at this point, can you just explain to us a little bit of why that is? Because as we get into the kind of the exodus of this story and kind of where it actually gets to now, because things start getting a bit nuts, why is it such an important case?
I think because it was an unfair murder. I mean, nobody deserves to be murdered, firstly, but I suppose you can say that's the case of all cases, of all situations. And this poor girl was trying to do everything in her powers and with the legal system to get away, to get protection, to survive. And she's just been up until what we've discussed now, she's been let down numerous times by that system. And I mean, she's going to be let down a lot more as you'll see as we progress through this case study. And it was just so damn unfair. And then you have a guy who never once showed any remorse. Even until today, he still blames her for the fact that he killed her. And as you'll see, he took some steps as we get into the presentation, the talk, where he just, again, was trying to evade responsibility for doing this. And it's just, here's a guy who just literally doesn't want to accept that he's done something wrong.
We can't even get the archetypal abuser who murders somebody in front of a crowd of people. We can't even get them locked up. I kind of get where your frustration, if that's where your frustration's coming from, I get it. Now talk to us about what happened to this guy from this point on and how he continues to manage to buck the system.
Yeah, so we're basically preparing for trial. He's found fit to stand trial by the hospital and not having a mental illness during the incident. So perhaps we should also say, how did I get involved? Because I get contacted probably 6 weeks after the incident by the first prosecutor who gets us on his table. And he was very smart because he'd attended some training that I presented about, sort of the temporary insanity defense, or as we call it, non-pathological criminal capacity. He said, I can see that if this guy doesn't plead guilty, it's going to go the route of one of those very complicated psychological defenses. Let me phone Gerhard, who I had, whose course I attended as a prosecutor, and see what he has to say. And I get in and I say, I agree with you 100%. This is going to go one of those routes of him going to claim some, like you say, temporary insanity type of defense. So I start to get involved, and I see that the docket is not prepared for that, because typically what happens when you've arrested a guy at the scene, the cops all go, great, open and shut case. I mean, he's arrested right next to her dead body. We've got CCTV footage. This is open and shut. I don't need to do my work properly. That's actually what I hear when I hear someone say open and shut. I'm about to not do things properly.
Yeah.
And also they gave it to a very inexperienced constable because this isn't a complicated case. He's arrested there. We don't have to put our best detectives onto this. And I realized that if it's going to go the route of one of these defenses, they don't in the docket yet have all the necessary information. So I started to interview the various other witnesses who were there that there weren't statements from about his exact behavior from when they arrived onto the scene. What was he doing? What was he saying? So I started to take the necessary statements that would help refute or confirm any such defense in the future. So in essence, I kind of in a way took over the investigation, filling all of these gaps as to what is needed. So basically, but once that's done, we were essentially waiting for the case to start, which would have been in, I think it was May 2013, so literally 2 years after the murder. And on that day, we're all waiting in the courtroom, his lawyer's there, and he doesn't arrive. And we knew he'd been staying at his mother, and I'd met the mother a few times in the process of, obviously, my inquiries and my investigations, and she was actually very cooperative. And she had said from the start, I knew one day I'm going to get a phone call saying that Gerard killed Andrea, because she knew what he was like, and she'd seen his jealous, controlling behavior, specifically in the time that he had stayed with her over the years and his behavior with previous girlfriends. Mm-hmm. And so I go to her, because now we're wondering, we say to his lawyer, where is your client? It's like, I have no idea. So we realize he ain't coming. And we go to the mom, who he had been staying with. That was one of his bail conditions. And she's like, yesterday he went off to go do some work in Limpopo province, and he hasn't come back. And I could tell she wasn't being honest with us. But I also knew at that point to sort of kick and scream and shout is not going to work. Mm. So we start to make our inquiries. We start to interview other people. He started dating someone else in this time that he would give him bail. He had a new girlfriend who at first didn't know who he was. He said to her, my name is Andrea Venter, not Gerhard Jansen van Vuuren. Okay. And one day, she and Gerhard are in the car, and he pulls up at the builder's warehouse, and he says, I'm going to quickly buy something inside builder's warehouse. And she says, that's okay, I'll stay in the car. And she starts to go through his cubbyhole, the glove compartment, and finds a driver's license with his picture, but it's not Gerhard Venter, it's Gerhard Jansen van Vuuren. So she then later on afterwards goes and Googles, and she finds out exactly who he is and what he's standing trial for. But she still dates him. And in fact, they have twins thereafter. So we go speak to her, and she can tell she's not being cooperative and telling us what's what. But a day or two later...
This is why I don't do relationships.
A day or two later, I get a phone call from the mom again. And she says, look, you got to come see me immediately. I have to tell you something. And I thought, okay, now we're going to hear the true story. So we speed over to her and have an interview with her. And she says, let me tell you, I feel I have to tell you what actually happened. So while he was awaiting trial, before he got bail, at 8 months from May till about December of 2011, when he was in Johannesburg Central Prison in the awaiting trial section, he meets up in prison with 2 Brazilian nationals who themselves had been arrested, but for drug-related charges. And one of them was an ex-federal policeman from Brazil. And basically, long story short, they say to him, hey, dude, but hey, if you ever get out, come to Brazil. We'll help you. We'll sort you out. So after he gets bail at December 2011, coincidentally, their case was withdrawn against them, the 2 Brazilians. So they come for dinner one night at the mom's house, and they formulate further consolidate this plan of, if you can get to Brazil, we're going to help you. So the mom gave us the name of those 2 Brazilians, and she tells us exactly that Gerhard then online booked a ticket, or on the phone booked a ticket to Brazil via Dubai.
Doesn't sound like mom is walking on the right side of the law.
At that point, no. But you also have to understand her history of domestic violence towards her, etc. And the father is still alive and around.
Fair enough.
And she says to him that, and how he got a passport was that a friend of his or acquaintance of his, he asked him to reapply for their acquaintance's own passport, and somehow they managed to put Gerard's picture into that passport application. So when the passport was issued, it was a real person with real details, but with someone else's photograph, in other words, Gerard's. As I said, he booked the ticket, he went into the bank and paid the tickets. We've got CCTV footage of him going into that particular bank and paying for the ticket that he booked online or over the phone. And then the day that he disappeared, which I think was a day or two before the trial, his father drove him down to King Shaka Airport in Durban, and we have the CCTV footage of him getting on that plane and via Dubai going to Brazil. Now, South Africans don't need a visa for Brazil, so he could literally pitch up there. And he hooks up with his 2 colleagues. But the mother also gave us the phone number that he phoned her from once he arrived there, saying, I'm safe, everything's okay. And she gives us this information, which we then, obviously give to the Brazilian police. We contact the embassy here in South Africa. We meet with their federal, their legal attaches who are federal policemen. They were very helpful. And essentially, by August, they arrest him one morning as he's walking down the street.
What are the extradition?
So we don't have
arrangements
an
with
extradition treaty with Brazil, but a lot of people think that means you can't be extradited from a country if you don't have a treaty. That is not at all the case. The treaty just makes it easier, that there are less hoops to jump through, because a lot of the issues are negotiated and discussed. So it's a lot faster if you have an extradition treaty, but it doesn't mean you can't if you don't have one. So I think that was maybe A, convenience, because he knew these guys could set him up. B, he doesn't need a visa. And he maybe thought, well, I can't be extradited, back from Brazil. So essentially, he's arrested one morning walking down the street. He's charged with being in the country illegally.
Where are we now? What year are we in when he's arrested?
August 2013. So the same year that he disappeared.
Yes, okay.
A couple months later.
Okay.
So we're all happy. The father is ecstatic. The mother of Andrea is ecstatic and very grateful. And we're all, chuffed. And we start the procedures for the extradition. We've got Advocate J.J. van Sale, who was at the DPP, Director of Public Prosecutions in Johannesburg. He was the extradition guy, and he had done many well-known high-profile extraditions. So we're happy. Everything's sorted. Everything's there. They convict him, as I said, for being in the country illegally, and I think they gave him like a 1.5 year, 2 year sentence. But they insisted that he serve that sentence before he comes back to South Africa. Now, normally, if we have someone that we need to extradite to another country because he's, arrested for a serious crime, we won't insist that he serves whatever little tiny sentence here, because if that case is a more serious case,
Just get him locked up for life.
it's like that's a murder trial. We're going to definitely not worry about you being in the country illegally or that you got into a fight and assault. We're going to pretty much send you back there that they can deal with you in a more severe way. So, but besides that, we've got the extradition warrant of arrest that's being served upon him. So he's actually also sitting in custody because of an arrest warrant for the extradition. So there's two things keeping him in prison. So, but they insist, and we now go through this frustrating waiting period of him to go through that, while again the extradition process
Although the
is going.
thought of him sitting in a South American jail, which I'm sure is not the greatest.
Yep.
It's not terrible.
Yeah, it's not a nice
At
place.
least you know where he is.
I know guys who are awaiting
Nice.
extradition in the United
Not
States,
good
and they're
for them.
sitting in quite comfy, nice prisons. This is not
Yes,
that.
yes,
It's hell. So what happens? I kind of leave the police in 2016, as you all know. I left in March 2016. We're just waiting for him to be brought back. And then one day I get a phone call from my colleague saying, we need to go to DIRCO, the Foreign Affairs Office in Department of International Relations and Cooperation, which is the new name for Foreign Affairs. We need to go there in...
This is the case that's on your mind. When you leave cases behind as an investigator, that is something that you carry with you. It's not like you
Yep.
can leave those stories behind and leave the people that you've established
Absolutely. I mean-
relationships with behind. So it's something, and again, I think this goes, surely this adds to why it's quite a meaningful case to you, because you want to be able to resolve those cases which started when you were on active duty.
Yeah, so I mean, I've gotten to know his mom and dad, her mom and dad, very relatively well. I've gotten to know his mom. And his dad hates me at this point because Gerhard and his dad are sort of two birds of a feather. But the mom, I've had very good, a relationship with, in a professional relationship with. So, yeah, so in a sense, I know the case on a personal level. I mean, I'd never met Andrea, of course, and I didn't know her until she was murdered.
No, but you feel a degree of responsibility towards it and towards her.
And also because in a way I kind of took over the case, having to prepare it for trial later on. So I get a call from my colleague who says, "Look, we need to go to Foreign Affairs head office, where we're met with by the Brazilian people from the Brazilian embassy." And they say, "Well, very embarrassed to say, but he's been released." And we say, "But how? We have an extradition warrant with you that he's arrested on."
So he served his sentence and they let him out?
Well,
Or
yes.
he was let out on good behavior or something like that?
So what happened is that one night a Brazilian judge goes to the prison and says, "You need to release this man. His sentence is finished." And they said, but we have an extradition warrant that he's arrested for, pending his extradition.
This is gangster stuff.
Nope, I instruct you to release him.
Corruption. That's corruption, isn't it? That's,
And they couldn't explain to us. They said this judge had no authority to do that. It was immediately reversed once, the next day, once the main judge heard what had happened. But obviously he's gone. And he disappeared. So basically, from pretty much early 2016.
So chances are these two Brazilians he met in jail in South Africa, really helpful for Gerhard.
Yeah, I mean, they definitely helped him to get set up initially. And I'm sure after he was released, they were helping him get
does
set
he
up
know in
again.
Brazil? Yeah,
exactly.
exactly.
So that's it. So 2016, he's gone. And I mean, of course, to tell that father, this is what happened. It was just, for me, heartbreaking, and of course, even more so for the family. And so he's on the run, and that was 2016, and kind of nothing really significant is happening until about 2020. So for 4 years, you're following up on leads here and there. I'm out the police, so I'm not actively involved in the case, but my colleagues are, trying to follow up here and there, but really nothing is going anywhere. Until we get information in 2020, just after sort of COVID hit, obviously lockdown, etc., we start to get information, well, not me, but the police started getting information that could lead to tracking him down. And essentially, long story short, he is eventually located again in Brazil and arrested by the federal police. And within about, I think, was it 6 weeks, he's brought back to South Africa.
Okay. Well, good. Eventually. They get him back here. And all of that is encouraging. Well done, Brazil. Well done, federal Brazilian police for catching up with him eventually.
And what was sad is in the meantime that Andrea's mother had passed away. So she died knowing that Gerard's somewhere out free and on the run. So she never, unfortunately, got
that sense of justice.
To die with at least feeling that, he's going to be brought to book. And now, of course, we have to go get ready for trial. The same prosecutor that had been dealing with it all those years ago, Advocate Paul Skitter, unfortunately, shortly before the trial was supposed to start, wasn't able to continue. So that was a bit sad because he'd been with it, from the start. Paul Skitter had been one of the guys prosecuting the Devilsdorp, Krugersdorp, Devilsdorp story case. So I'd worked on him with multiple other cases, a highly competent prosecutor. Gets given to another prosecutor in the meantime, which I wasn't very comfortable with because I didn't think she really understood the case and the nature of what the issues were in this case. And thankfully, about, I think, a month before we actually were to set down to finally go on trial, it gets handed over to Advocate Relien Barnard, who I also knew. If you read my first or second book, we spoke about Brian the Stalker. No, I think it was the second book. In that chapter, when I talk about how I got a high court prosecutor to review the charge sheet because I wasn't happy with the charge sheet that the magistrate's court prosecutor put together, that was actually, it turns out, and I forgot about that, was actually Relien Barnard. But she was a very good, qualified, experienced prosecutor, and she really, you could see, understood what the nuances of this prosecution was going to be about, the mental health issues.
Because he really tries to duck and dive now using arguments that are very much in your universe, in your wheelhouse, to try and get out of this bike. So he's trying to get taken to the loony bin and not Sun City.
And exactly as that very first prosecutor who saw the docket within weeks of the case, who contacted me to say, look, Gerard, I think you should get involved because this is going to go, he was right. It went exactly that route with him trying to bring in my mind at the time was not, I was not in control of my behaviors, defense, which would have meant, if successful, either he could be completely discharged and found not guilty for temporary insanity, or, if anything, he might have gone back to a hospital as opposed to a prison to serve his sentence.
It is very interesting in the case, and maybe you can just do a brief version of this, is to lay out kind of what the rationale is that he was acting, he knew what he was doing, that he could not be declared mentally unfit for trial or what have you. Could you lay out a little bit of that argument and also talk about this other guy that turns up, the defense psychologist, who seemed quite out of his depth?
So we kind of suspected that they were going to go the route of raising some kind of psychological defense, to call it that. And we obviously present the state's case. They admitted a lot of evidence saying, yes, we don't deny he was the one that stabbed her, et cetera, and the autopsy report is correct. So really, we just really had to hash out his mental state at the time. So the prosecution obviously calls Dr. Leon Fine, who was retired at that point, but a very experienced forensic psychiatrist who had done the observation back in, 2012, with one of the two psychiatrists who wrote the report, and says this guy has no diagnosis that affects his ability to determine right from wrong back then. He can stand trial. He's criminally responsible from a mental health point of view for what he did.
This is Dr. Leon Fine.
Yes. They also call, for example, the paramedic who was present at the scene, who says, at one point, Gerhard turns to him while he's lying next to Andrea's body and says to the paramedic, is she dead yet? Not, geez, what happened? What's going on? Is she okay? But is she dead yet? And that's a very, very specific, and that's meaning like, I'm waiting for her to die. Has she died yet? And I know what has happened. It's not like, my goodness, what's going on around me? And how, when one of the colonels arrived on the scene of the day of the incident, he says, when she understands what the situation is, she said, well, if he's injured and he's a suspect, he needs to go to Leratong Hospital because we have a ward where we keep suspects under police guard. And he's like, no, I've got medical aid. I need to go to this hospital, private hospital. So he's in touch with his surroundings. And other sort of things he was saying when one witness ran up and said, my God, what happened? He's like, I stabbed her because she was screaming. So now all those tiny little things, which fortunately, because I was involved right in the beginning, we gathered that stuff in statements from these witnesses. It's not like we have to ask them 10 years later or more, can you remember what he said? So those little bits and pieces, what we're trying to illustrate is that at the time of the incident, he was not out of touch with reality. He's aware of his surroundings. He knew what had happened. The fact that you afterwards are saying, I don't remember anything, because he's saying, I don't remember anything. which is part of his defense of like, I wasn't in control of my behavior at the time because of what we would refer to in American terminology, temporary insanity.
What is non-path?
So obviously different legal systems come up with fancy different terms to describe essentially what is a temporary insanity. But essentially, when a person commits a crime, you want to look at, was he in control of his behavior? And there can be a few reasons why not. So one of them might be mental illness. If I am schizophrenic and I'm psychotic at the time and I'm hearing voices, the voice is telling me Paul's coming to kill me, not to give me a cup of coffee because he's my buddy, and you need to kill him because he's an alien in Paul's body that's going to do something to you. Clearly, you could say that the person is not in control of their behavior. They can't determine right from wrong. They're out of touch with reality. We can't hold you criminally responsible for your behaviors. And if the court agreed with that after an assessment, you would then go to a psychiatric hospital to be treated. And you're not going there for punishment because we can't punish you if you are not in control of your behavior at the time. It's not a voluntary act of what you did. It was you, but it was not voluntary because you weren't in control of your behavior. And then you go to a psychiatric hospital as a forensic patient, but not as punishment, but as to treat you. And once you're okay, you're released back into society. And that could be 5 years, it could be 1 year. But the other option is that you're not in control of your behavior, not because of a mental illness like, say, schizophrenia, but because of a temporary emotional state that was fleeting in nature. And that's when we talk about non-pathological, in other words, not due to pathology, meaning like schizophrenia, temporary criminal capacity, or non-path. So the legal system in South Africa has also referred to that as automatism, sane automatism, because it's not due to mental illness. And that's the kind of terminology that the courts kind of throw around. And unfortunately, it's a thing that the courts haven't themselves quite properly defined yet. What are the criteria? What exactly is it? So it's one of those defenses where you get judgments that are quite varied. Court A might see it this way and not convict the guy. Court B might see it this way and release the guy or convict him.
How often have you seen a court convinced?
So in my cases and I worked on a handful of these over the years that I was in the police. It was never successful in the incidences where I was involved. I'm not saying because I was involved, but it was never a success. So the court and acknowledges that it's a very difficult defense to use, and it's very rarely successful.
Sure.
But you still do get some weird judgments where you think, how on earth could they have let him go, saying that was a non-path scenario? So it's a risky defense, and one does not lightly try it, because if it fails, then you're going to get no sympathy from the court.
And if you find yourself in this circumstance and Gerard happens to be sitting on the other side of the room from you, just might as well throw in the towel right there and then, because he's got a 100% track record. What is intermittent explosive disorder? Because it seems like this is one of these non-path kind of problems that, and this is what the defense referred to quite a lot, this IED, or intermittent explosive disorder. I think maybe I have it.
This was kind of the again, illustrating where legal people don't understand the concepts, because what they said their defense was going to be is that we believe our client suffered from a non-pathological criminal capacity at the time of the incident due to intermittent explosive disorder, which is actually contradictory, because intermittent explosive disorder is a diagnosis. It's a pathology. So you can't say non-path and also
he's got cancer because of the cancer.
Yeah, so it's really it's what they should have said is, we believe he wasn't in control of his behavior due to intermittent explosive disorder, and then it would have been a pathology defense.
Yes.
Not a temporary insanity, because it's not temporary. Intermittent explosive disorder is not temporary. It's you have it. It comes, it fluctuates in its intensity maybe, or today you have an outburst, tomorrow you don't. Yeah. So it is one of those things where they're using non-path, but the basis of the non-path is not like he was provoked, or he just lost his shit, to put it that way, or he was having a bad day and then this sort of circumstances of events came upon him and just lost it. You're saying it was because of this disorder he has. So it was legally, well, from a psychologist's point of view, you're talking about two opposing types of terms.
Yes.
But that's
and I understand that this psychologist had not had the opportunity to speak to Gerhard, that he was working off the basis of information provided to him solely by the defense team.
Yeah. So that's what they came with. So we knew how to prepare. We called, as I said, Leon Fine to represent the observation team. He said, look, this guy has no disorders. You know, there's no intermittent.
He's been
nothing.
with a team at Sterkman team
For a month.
processing it, processing him and observing him
24 hours a day.
Exactly.
So he was the first witness. Then we called all these other witnesses that I said a moment ago who could comment on his behavior, the paramedic, the bystanders, the colonel who arrived, the security guard, all those people to say, but at the time, this is how he was behaving. Then they closed the state's case, and the defense, the only person the defense called, they didn't call Gerard because, again, a lot of criminal cases go ahead without the accused being called, and that's their right not to have to testify. And the courts are warned you can't automatically draw a negative conclusion by the fact that the accused person isn't testifying. But they called Dr. Wynekove, who was a retired, I think it was said he was 77-year-old psychiatrist, who in his career had done, I think, two previous criminal cases. With this, I think one of them was with the same attorney that briefed him in this case, who was representing Francois Hubert, who was representing Gerard. It was very clear, and this is also what the judge says, so it's not my opinion, that he was not an expert in forensic matters, let alone...
Well, he was judged to be not an expert for the sake of the case, wasn't
found that he was unreliable evidence.
So his evidence was not allowed to be used for consideration in the
who,
verdict.
I think, as the judge said, was almost like naively amazed by this case and was trying to find an explanation why he did it. And that's not how you do a forensic assessment. You don't try to find a psychiatric explanation. You look for symptoms. And if there are no symptoms, then there is no psychiatric explanation.
Yes.
And even the presence of a disorder doesn't mean that's why the person committed this crime.
Yeah.
There has to be that legal nexus between the crime and the actual criminal act.
I mean, had he even considered that it could be, or debunked other types of disorders that it might have been? Or?
No, because that's interesting, because he said, well, I don't think the Dr. Fine and the observation team considered this. But this guy didn't consider anything else except IED. He didn't even consider that possibly this was just domestic violence. And in fact, at one point he said he thinks that all domestic violence is actually intermittent explosive disorder, which is, it's like what you're saying is people aren't responsible for their behavior when they go and beat up their wives, which is hugely controversial and very, very, most people would say, you just can't say that. You're pathologizing domestic violence, that it's not that person's fault. That is bizarre. So he had a very rough time in cross-examination. He admitted he's not an expert on IED. He doesn't think he's ever diagnosed IED before. And really, as we were expecting, that its evidence was not going to hold much sway. But again, if we didn't have such a great prosecutor, and again, advised by me and advised by Dr. Fine, if we had a weaker prosecutor, this might have been a very different story. And we hadn't had, say, me, who was from the start knowing what we need to gather evidentially to refute or confirm such a potential defense later on. So the judge, like you say, was very critical of Dr. Wynekove and basically just excluded his evidence in its entirety. And then said, in these types of defenses that they were raising, although there's not an expectation that the accused has to testify in general, in these cases, you kind of do. Because you need to say, you can't introduce evidence via your lawyer. My client says that he doesn't remember. My client says this, that, and the other. And the court said, actually, in this case, he did need to get into that witness box and say what happened, what he remembered and what he didn't remember. And also, i.e., that temporary state would have been only for the stabbing. What about the noose around the car?
Yes.
That would have happened long before
all of the other
IED or the non-path episode.
behaviors.
What about the blood at her house?
Yeah.
He could have come to explain that. What about the blood in her flat, which would have occurred not when he was in a state of this temporary non-pathological state, temporary insanity state, where he would have amnesia. And he didn't come and explain that. So that was, again, critical against him, which I think was bad legal representation by his lawyers.
So a lesson here is that things are only obvious if there's an effective team presenting them as such. And if you, in another circumstance where you'd had a less capable or competent prosecution team, he could have continued to avoid taking accountability for his action.
Yeah.
What was the verdict?
So the Brazilians in the extradition agreement said they'll extradite him as long as the prosecution won't request longer than a 30-year jail sentence. That's probably because in Brazil, that's the maximum length for a murder. Often we won't extradite somebody to a country if they're going to get longer for a sentence than we would have given them here. And definitely if that country like the USA has a death sentence, and that's what this person is potentially facing, we would say, we're not going to extradite him unless you guarantee us he won't be given the death sentence.
Yes.
Which I suppose you can say it's you're trying to enforce your values on another country. How can we say we don't have the death sentence here when we knowingly let someone back to a different country where they're going to get killed or death sentence? So I kind of get the argument. Frustrating because, this was essentially, you should have been facing life for this. But the judge pointed out that the extradition agreement just says that the prosecution won't request life sentence. Not that the judge is bound. And that comes to also with our wonderful democracy, separation of powers. Foreign affairs can't say
you asked or not.
Foreign affairs can't say and bind the judiciary to a sentence.
Yes.
Separation of powers.
Yes.
So the judge pointed out, and the prosecution, Raline Barnard, didn't ask for life. She said, "My lord, I request 29 years sentence." And the judge said, "Thank you very much." And he came back and said, this was a premeditated murder. Not pre-planned in the sense that he sat there for days, how am I going to kill her on Friday night? But premeditated in the sense when he ran after her with that knife, and if you look at what happened back at his flat, where this incident must have started, he said this was premeditated. Therefore, I'm going to give you life. And that's what he's currently facing. I did hear from the prosecutor on Friday when I saw her again, that he is going to appeal not just the length of his sentence, probably arguing that the extradition agreement said one thing, but also his actual conviction. So I'd love to see what his arguments are going to be, definitely for his conviction, because, what's he going to say? My evidence of my psychiatrist was wrongly excluded? But I guess he's just a chancer trying to take a chance, So we'll see. But I don't think he's going to be successful in either reducing his length of sentence or his actual conviction.
One of those guys, though, you want to keep an eye on, Gerard. Just once a year, just check in with correctional services. Is he still there?
Absolutely. And I kind of think
he's
the
obviously
kind of
a
guy,
wily character.
He's the kind of guy that in prison he's probably going to do well because he's an IT guru. He's probably going to offer to fix everybody's computers in prison and wangle himself a cushy scenario and win favor with everybody. That I really do fear that when he comes up for parole, they're all going to think he's fantastic.
Yeah.
That's, I think, a realistic possibility and my concern, because let me put it very carefully, he's a very manipulative and conning type of person. I mean, we saw that how he got out the country the first time around, that he can bullshit people very well.
And a massive lack of compassion.
Yeah. Not accepting responsibility for what he's done.
Yeah.
That, he was wrong. He shouldn't have done this. Maybe there were pressures that were pushing him this way or the other, but ultimately, you're in control of yourself and you shouldn't have done this. And he does not want to accept responsibility for that, even till today.
Yeah.
He still views it as, she's dead, it's her fault, not his.
You do, of course, though, have the reward that one of those cases that could have been left behind when you left the police service, you had the opportunity to stay involved and to see it to a good conclusion. And hopefully the correctional services will keep him under lock and key for a fair amount of time. Of course, we all know in South Africa that in 25 years he'll come up for parole regardless, won't he?
Yeah, so he'll have his hearings, whether he'll get it. Like I said, I do have a fear and concern that if he does behave in his sort of very charming, schmarmy, manipulative way, he probably will get parole at 25 years from now. Yeah. But also then he will be about, I think he's now early 40s. He will be 60, 65.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, 25, that's kind of the best we can hope for in South Africa, no matter what you do, really, isn't it? Unless you're one of the really, really out there serial killer types. Or if you murdered somebody that's high profile even then, I mean, doesn't even get into Oscar. All right, well, a great case to talk about our first time back, and nice to be able to talk about one which was such a big kind of journey for yourself. The scary thing is that at the end of a conversation like this, with all the lessons you learn about all the kind of takeouts, that this is a really classic case of domestic abuse where there was a lot of awareness with family, etc., about what was the reality in this woman's life. I mean, the mom of Gerhard even felt that one day she was going to get a call that her son had committed an act of violence against Andrea and possibly even killed her. So I'm left with the question is, what do you kind of take away from this crime that people who are suffering domestic abuse, who are listening to this, might be able to use to their benefit if they're in South Africa and have these kinds of issues? And the sad thing is that it's like, I mean, there's not really much you can say to people.
Yeah, I mean, there have been success stories where protection orders worked and the police responded and they did stop the person from his behavior. But there's also a lot of success, a lot of failure stories. So it's really difficult. I can tell you what the options are. I can't tell you what the outcome is going to be, or even the likely outcome.
Yeah, you have to kind of keep a track of
But
exactly what laws are being broken by the person that is committing these acts against
and
you.
evidence of it.
My advice to people is simply, you just can't afford to get into any kind of a relationship from day one where there's any evidence
Controlling
of
behavior,
these kinds of controlling
who
behavior.
you, where you, what you're wearing, where you're
someone's
going
looking
to.
on your cell phone, exactly. Somebody's trying to tell you what to wear, like you say. Somebody
Isolating you
is-
from friends and family. Walk away then.
You have to leave as soon as you can, because the deeper into the rabbit hole you get, you can find yourself screaming for help, surrounded by people, and still lose your life.
And know what the hook is. In the beginning, these guys can be exactly what you want in a partner. But it changes, but you start to think, but I know what he can be. I've seen it. But you start to almost cling on to that little glimmer and not noticing that glimmer is like a star in a dark night sky.
Yeah.
And that's almost what keeps them stuck there, is that there is this wonderful side. But unfortunately, that is not what you are seeing. And when the time you do get to that point, it's almost like too late.
Leave right now.
Yeah.
Leave right now. That's the only advice we can
Because
give
they're
you.
not going to change.
They're not going to change, and you don't want to join the lottery that is the justice system.
And with your life. Yeah.
Thank you, Gerard. We'll be back next week for another conversation. Please do get in touch with us on social media and, let us know if you have any feedback. Let me know if I've been talking too much again. I've really got a complex about talking too much from some feedback we get. I'm just going to try to stop doing it. I'm going to stop doing it right now. Thanks, Gerard.
Cheers, Paul.
See you next week.
Thanks,
Bye.
listeners.